It happened before most of Britain even opened its eyes. At 4:47 on a freezing Friday morning, while streets were still dark and quiet, Buckingham Palace dropped a statement so brutally short, so devastatingly final, that even veteran royal correspondents froze mid-scroll, rereading it again and again because their minds refused to accept what they are. Eyes were seeing 29 words. No padding, no gentle language. No monitoring the situation, no remaining optimistic. Just the truth. The king's doctors had advised that treatment was no longer working. End-of-life care had begun at Windsor Castle. The family had been summoned. This was the end. King Charles III, the man who waited 7 decades to wear the crown, was dying after barely 3 years on the throne. There was no slow public buildup, no staged updates to soften the blow. One moment, the palace was insisting the king was managing his condition. The next, the nation was told the impossible had already arrived. Within seconds, the BBC cut its programming. The presenter's voice cracked, not dramatically, but involuntarily, because this wasn't rehearsal anymore. Sky News graphics appeared with frightening speed, as if history had been sitting preloaded, waiting. And in America, CNN interrupted primetime television, their anchors visibly pausing to steady themselves before speaking. Outside Windsor Castle, people began arriving before sunrise, drawn by instinct more than information. An elderly woman stood crying at the gates, whispering that he had waited his entire life and barely been given time to be king. Inside Kensington Palace, William had already been awake for hours. At 3:30 a.m., his phone rang with a call no son is ever ready to receive. His father's condition had collapsed. The words "prepare yourself" had already been spoken. Reading the official statement on his phone didn't soften it. It made it real. Charles wasn't dying someday. He was dying now. William stood at the window, still wearing yesterday's clothes, staring into darkness that felt endless. Catherine didn't ask how he was. She simply stood beside him and took his hand, because words were useless now. "The children," William finally said, his voice torn apart by tears. "George needs to say goodbye." Within minutes, Catherine was waking their children before dawn, explaining the unexplainable, telling them they had to leave immediately, that this might be the last time they would ever see their grandfather alive. Their convoy tore through empty London streets, urgency overriding every rule. George sat rigid, trying to be brave. Charlotte cried quietly. Louis held Catherine's hand and kept asking when they would arrive. At Windsor, Princess Anne had never left. She had been there all night, watching her brother drift in and out of consciousness, holding his hand during fleeting moments of recognition, listening as the medical team slowly admitted what they could no longer fix. The cancer had won. Camilla hadn't moved from Charles's side either. She sat beside him, holding his hand, talking to him even when he couldn't answer, because presence was all she had left to give. After decades of waiting, of scrutiny, of fighting to stand beside him, she was now facing the cruelest irony of all. She would lose him almost as soon as they finally had everything. 72 hours earlier, there had still been hope. Doctors believed they could stabilize him. Aggressive treatment was buying time, though at a terrible cost. Then, suddenly, the monitors told a different story. His organs were failing faster than predicted. The cancer had spread invisibly, aggressively, silently. The emergency consultation was swift and devastating. They were no longer treating illness, they were managing the end. When Charles was told that treatment was no longer working, he didn't panic. He asked questions, he asked timelines. How long? Days, maybe a week. He nodded. "I need to speak to William." That private conversation happened late Tuesday night. Raised voices, long silences, then unmistakable sobbing. When William emerged hours later, he collapsed into Catherine's arms, completely broken. By Wednesday, Charles was confused, slipping between clarity and disorientation. By afternoon, his heart briefly stopped. Doctors revived him, but quietly told Camilla that the next episode might be the one they couldn't reverse. By Thursday evening, he had entered the active dying phase. Breathing, labored, awareness fading. That's when the call was made. Prepare the statement. At 4:47 a.m., Britain was told the truth. And at 3:32 a.m., the emergency summons went out to the family. Come immediately. Final hours. William didn't need explanation. When Anne reached Harry in California, she didn't soften it. Your father is dying. If you want to say goodbye, you must leave now. Harry tried. But time and distance were cruel. Even with private transport, he would not arrive in time. The room at Windsor was transformed, clinical but intimate, machines humming softly, lights dimmed. Camilla sat holding Charles's hand. When William entered with Catherine and the children, Camilla looked up, eyes wrecked by grief. He's been waiting for you. Charles stirred when William took his hand. You came. I'm here, Dad. George stepped forward, voice breaking. We love you, Grandpa. And for a moment, just a moment, Charles seemed peaceful. As dawn broke, Charles used every remaining moment to say what mattered. To William, you'll be a better king than I ever was. To Catherine, I know you'll take care of them. To George, being king is about service, not crowns. To Anne, you were always the strongest. And finally, Camilla leaned close and whispered something no one else heard. Whatever she said, it gave him permission. His breathing slowed. At 8:43 a.m., King Charles III stopped breathing. Silence. Then the words no one wanted to hear, he has passed. Camilla collapsed. Anne broke. Catherine pulled the children close. And William felt the crown fall onto him. Not ceremonially, but brutally. He was king now. Within minutes, duty invaded grief. Documents, proclamations, signatures. Catherine demanded 10 minutes, but history does not pause. The announcement went out at 9:15 a.m. Phones lit up across the world. King Charles III is dead. William called Harry himself. You didn't make it in time. The sound Harry made was raw animal grief. By late morning, William stood before the accession council, face ravaged by loss, accepting a crown he did not want yet. By afternoon, he addressed the nation. I wish I were speaking to you as a son, not as your king. The tears were real. The grief was visible. By evening, the machinery of monarchy had stabilized, but in private rooms, the family sat shattered. George asked the question no child should have to ask. Does this mean I'll be king one day? Yes, William said softly, but not today. Today, they mourn, because crowns cannot protect against death. And sometimes the heaviest burden is not the crown, but the grief beneath it. Night fell over Windsor Castle, but sleep never came. Not for William, not for Camilla, not for anyone who had stood in that room and watched a crown pass hands through death instead of ceremony. The castle felt hollow now, like something ancient had been unplugged from its own heartbeat. Corridors that once echoed with quiet authority now carried whispers, hushed footsteps, and the strange sound of a monarchy trying to reorganize itself while still bleeding. Camilla remained alone in rooms that were suddenly no longer hers. The bed was still warm. His glasses still rested where he'd left them. The weight of silence pressed so hard it felt physical. For decades, she had been defined by standing beside him, fighting, enduring, waiting. And now, for the first time, there was no beside. There was only absence. Anne moved through the castle with grim purpose, making calls, coordinating arrangements, doing what she had always done best, carrying duty when others couldn't. Her composure never cracked in public, but when she passed a window and caught her reflection, even she barely recognized the woman staring back. William sat with his children in a private room that felt far too small for the reality pressing in on them. George was quiet, unnaturally quiet, absorbing not just grief, but the terrifying understanding that his future had shifted permanently overnight. Charlotte clung to Catherine, refusing to let go, while Louis cried until exhaustion overtook him, the kind of crying that only comes when a child realizes something will never return. William tried to explain what he barely understood himself, that Grandpa was gone, that love remains, that nothing would ever be exactly the same again. But he couldn't explain the part he hadn't said out loud yet, that from this moment forward, everything they did would be watched differently, that grief would not excuse mistakes, that childhood had just shortened. Outside the castle gates, the crowds didn't thin, they grew. Flowers stacked higher by the hour, handwritten notes pressed into iron railings. People stood in silence as if noise itself would feel disrespectful. Flags dropped to half-mast across Britain, across the Commonwealth, across places Charles had visited decades earlier, leaving behind impressions people never thought would matter so much until now. By midnight, the machinery of state was fully awake. Briefings continued, security was recalibrated, schedules rewritten. The words His Majesty the King were repeated again and again until they began to sound real, even as they still felt wrong. William sat alone later that night, staring at paperwork that carried centuries of authority and suddenly bored for his name. He signed where required, answered questions automatically, nodded when expected. Every movement felt like betrayal, as if acknowledging the crown too soon might mean forgetting his father too quickly. At one point, he stopped and simply stared at his hands, the same hands that had held his father's moments before he died, now tasked with ruling nations. When dawn came again, it felt cruel. Morning light spilled over Windsor, illuminating a world that refused to stop turning. News anchors spoke in hushed tones. Newspapers carried black borders. Children in schools asked teachers why flags were lowered. Old veterans stood in uniform one last time for a king who had waited nearly his entire life to serve them. And somewhere over the Atlantic, Harry landed knowing he was already too late. The moment he stepped off the plane, the truth crashed into him fully. No bedside, no final words, no chance to say what needed saying, just a phone call and a funeral to prepare for. When William finally spoke to him again later that day, the conversation was strained, fragile, heavy with everything unsaid. There were apologies that didn't need explaining and forgiveness that didn't need asking for. Grief stripped away politics, at least for now. Back in Britain, plans for the lying-in state began quietly forming. The nation would soon queue for miles. People would wait through cold nights just to stand still for seconds, because saying goodbye, even to someone you never met, matters. Camilla was informed gently, officially, that her role would change. Titles would shift. Protocols would adjust. The woman who had just lost her husband was now also expected to navigate widowhood under a microscope. She nodded, said very little, and later, when alone again, broke completely. William's first night as king ended without sleep. He stood once more at a window, just as he had the morning before, but now the darkness had lifted. London moved again, life resumed. And that somehow hurt the most, because the world had moved forward, even though part of his had ended forever. He understood now what his father had meant about service, about weight, about endurance. Grief would not pause history, pain would not delay duty, and love would have to coexist with responsibility whether he was ready or not. As Britain entered its official days of mourning, a quiet truth settled in. A king had died. A son had been broken. A new reign had begun, not with celebration, but with tears. And the crown, heavy with centuries of expectation, rested on a man still learning how to breathe without his father in the world. His father in the world. His father in the world. His father